Hello, everyone, and welcome to Neurocracy. Today, we're joined by Dr. Frank Scheer, professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and director of the Medical Chronobiology Program at Brigham and Women's Hospital. His research investigates how our biological clocks interact with behaviors like sleeping, eating, and exposure to light, and he has led groundbreaking studies testing countermeasures with important implications for anyone living in our 24/7 society. Dr. Scheer, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thanks a lot for having me, Sanjay.
So my first question for you is, how did you first get interested in circadian biology?
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I was looking for my second master's project to do in the Netherlands. And so I was doing interviews at the Netherlands Institute for Brain Research in Amsterdam. And there were a couple of investigators that had very, fascinating research. The working of the brain was something that really spoke to me. And there were two researchers. One was a sleep researcher.
Okay.
But and that was really interesting. But he was not going to be there. He was traveling a lot, and so that wasn't a good match. And there was another investigator who was doing something even more exciting in a way than just sleep, which is circadian rhythms. And why exciting? Well, because two things. One is that circadian rhythms affect virtually all aspects of our biology and our
Right.
behavior. And second is because this is all regulated by this tiny, tiny nucleus in the hypothalamus, the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And so, whereas sleep is a highly complex, whole cortex is involved. At that time, at least, it was thought that there was just this tiny structure the size of a pinhead that regulates it all. And so that was truly fascinating to me how that's possible, something so complex regulated by something so seemingly simple.
Right. So my next question is kind of more with your role in the Medical Chronobiology Program. And for those who might be for those who might not be familiar with it, what exactly is the program and what kind of questions do you and your team focus on?
Sure, yeah. So our program is interested in the role of the circadian system and its interaction with our environment and behaviors on health and behavior in the broader sense,
Right.
mostly cardiovascular and metabolic aspects of function. And so initial questions we addressed was why is it that people often have heart attacks in the morning more frequently than any other time of day.
Yeah.
Other questions are why is asthma worse at night? And so there's something called nocturnal asthma, which is defined by its presence at night. But even in people who don't have nocturnal asthma, asthma is typically worse at night. Um, and other questions are related to why are shift workers at increased risk for
Yeah.
chronic disease. Think about obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, depression, cancer, etc. And so many of these aspects either related to the temporal distribution of disease severity across the day or what happens when the alignment of our behaviors are no longer in sync with our circadian system beg the question if there's a role of that circadian system in these diseases. And so that's what we study.
Yeah.
We do this primarily by highly controlled in laboratory human studies,
Okay.
supplemented by field-based studies and some animal experimental work.
Yeah. So, kind of expanding on that topic of shift workers and the potential health risks they face, what are some of the biggest challenges for them, especially people who have to work like overnight or even irregular schedules? And are there any promising countermeasures for them?
Right. Yeah, so the most challenging for most people on the surface level is sleeping during the day and then staying awake during the night. And so that's something we're very conscious about when we're doing shift work, because you're feeling fatigued and not alert when you're on the job. And then when you're trying to sleep, when you're really tired, then you find out that you can't sleep as long as you thought you would and hoped you could. Um, but that's just the surface level. The other things that people are typically aware of, or maybe a little less, is that they can't cope with emotional stress as well. So they may be a little bit more sensitive
Okay.
to emotional stressors, as well as GI issues, so gastrointestinal problems that people are mostly aware of. But all the other aspects people are typically unaware of. And so there are many that relate to uh, changes in blood pressure regulation and glucose control, so blood sugar regulation, weight regulation, etc. Now, countermeasures is something that is really challenging. Of course, there's the classical sleep hygiene approaches. So think about, okay, when you try to sleep during the day, make sure your bedroom is quiet, dark, and that the temperature is not too hot or cold,
Yeah.
and you don't drink too much coffee right
Yeah.
before or caffeine right
Right.
before you try to go to sleep. But those only go so far because that addresses issues that are more related to behavioral and environmental factors. But it doesn't address the underlying mistiming of your desired sleep relative to your body clock. And we can
Yeah.
talk a bit more in detail about that aspect.
Yeah. That would be nice if you could elaborate.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
so I'll just continue then. So
Yeah.
one of the approaches that people have tried to investigate, for example, work by Charmaine Eastman in Chicago, she had tried to see if there is such a thing as a compromised sleep schedule. So if people on their free days wouldn't fully revert to being sleeping at night and being awake during the day, as most of us are. But if they could maintain to some degree daytime sleep and nighttime wakefulness, um, and a compromise because it kind of would be midway. And then the problem is there that you're not sleeping well during your work week, but also not sleeping well when you're during your time off.
Right.
So that hasn't really panned out. There are examples where people do maintain a really regular sleep-wake cycle. For example, on oil rigs or Arctic research stations,
Yeah.
people are really in a confined environment where they don't, you know, on their days off, they don't adjust their sleep-wake schedule because of their friends and family because they're not there. And so in those cases, people can adapt quite effectively to their night work, but it's really exceptions in that
Yeah.
case.
I do have a
So
question about that specifically.
sure,
I
yeah,
recently met someone who in the VA who actually was kind of working or like serving in a submarine, and they had an interesting sleep schedule where I think it was 6 hours sleep, 12 hours awake, if I'm not mistaken. I think it was an 18-hour day. Um,
yeah,
yeah, I just wanted to like kind of get your perspective on that.
yeah. I think an 18-hour day, and then afterward, I'll revert back to countermeasure. But the 18-hour day is probably one of the most horrible
Oh,
ways to to schedule your sleep wake
wow.
cycle. Um, because 16-hour cycle is far outside of the range of entrainment of the circadian system, meaning that your circadian system cannot keep up with that. And so what
Okay.
you're guaranteed to have is misalignment between
Right.
your imposed sleep-wake cycle and your internal body clock. And your body clock can never keep up. It cannot synchronize to that.
Yeah.
And so uh, yeah, so those schedules came into effect originally to try to maximize the use of the sleeping quarters, so that the people, when they had 6 hour sleep episodes, one would get out of bed and then the next one would go in, and so you would have in these very confined spaces you could use the space optimally. But I think in modern submarines there is more space, and so
Right.
often those original requirements are no longer needed as much. But some of these schedules were maintained for a long time just because that was the way things were done.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, so don't do that
Yeah.
if you have the choice.
Right.
Another countermeasure that we have focused on more recently is food timing.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so And so the first paper we had on this, and you probably have seen it, but was a paper by Sarah Shalapa, who was a postdoctoral fellow in the group and then was promoted to junior faculty and now is an associate professor at Southampton University in the UK, who studied the question whether if you mistime your sleep-wake and rest activity cycle, if you can prevent the negative health consequences by just fixing your eating fasting cycle to a 24-hour cycle. And why a 24-hour cycle? Well, because in our hands, in this particular protocol that we did, where people are living on a 28-hour day, and it's known as a forced desynchrony protocol. It's
Okay.
designed as a tool to investigate the independent effect of the circadian system by stripping away the 24-hour cycle and sleep, wake, rest, activity, light, dark, and eating, fasting. And so mathematically, we can tease apart what is the contribution of the circadian system versus the behavioral cycle on your outcome of interest. But what we know in those protocols is that the central clock in the suprachiasmatic nucleus runs at about 24-hour cycle. And so the goal of this protocol, therefore, was that if we now also schedule the eating fasting cycle to a 24-hour cycle, that now is then in synchrony with the central clock. And so if you reestablish synchrony of the eating fasting cycle, even though your sleep wake cycle is mistimed, can you limit some of these adverse health effects? And the answer was yes. And so not only could we limit it, we could prevent the adverse effects on the outcome measures we looked at. And so the Science Advances paper that was published in 2021, what we found was that in the control protocol, where people had a 28-hour sleep-wake cycle and where they also ate on a 28-hour sleep-wake cycle, people's blood sugar regulation was out of whack. And so their glucose tolerance was impaired, which is a diagnostic marker for risk for development of diabetes, type 2
Right.
diabetes. So that we replicated as we had found in previous studies. But when we now restricted the food intake just during the biological day, so having it run on a 24-hour cycle, we could prevent the negative effects of this mistimed sleep on glucose control. And so what this indicates is that in this particular protocol, the timing of food intake is more important than the timing of one's sleep-wake cycle for glucose regulation.
Wow.
So that's quite amazing. And we were
Yeah.
surprised actually because we thought it would be decreasing the negative health effects. We did not anticipate it would completely prevent the
Yeah.
negative health effects on glucose control. And interestingly, what we found, which we hypothesized, was that the timing of the glucose regulation by the circadian system was mistimed in the control protocol, where people ate on a 28-hour cycle. But that also was normalized when we limited the food intake during the biological day, meaning that we could prevent what's known as internal circadian misalignment, where different body clocks run on different time schedules.
Yeah.
And this is replicating in that sense what has been found previously in animal experimental work, that food timing is really key for metabolism and for internal circadian organization.
Yeah. In one of my interviews actually with Dr. Carla Green, we talked about consistent meal times. Like the whole interview is literally about like meal times. And we were specifically talking about how like at my high school, so we were kind of talking about high school start times and how so my school starts at 7:30, which is
Mhm.
obviously like early. And I know like I'm sure you know about like the misalignment with teenage like circadian like phase delay, etc. But we were kind of talking about how in my high school, like one person could be eating lunch at 10:40 a.m. and another could be eating at 12:25 p.m. And you could also be someone who has to eat at 10:40 one day and then the next day eat 12:25
right?
and then go back. So I guess like I mean, is that not like um I guess I mean it's a conversation between like logistics and biology, but what do you think about like that kind of mealtime like misalignment in high schools and throughout the US?
Right. Yeah, no, it brings up an interesting study that, well, there's a couple of interesting studies that were done in Harvard college students
Okay.
looking at the two factors of sleep timing. First, sleep. So one was, one typically thinks about sleep duration.
Yeah.
The other factor is sleep regularity. So what timing is your sleep today compared to yesterday? And so what was interesting to see is that there was a relationship between more irregular sleep-wake schedules and uh, negative relationship uh, with GPA, with college outcomes. Um, but the other factor regarding food timing, so Andrew McHill, who's now an associate professor at OHSU in Portland, Oregon, when he was a postdoc here, he looked at the timing of food intake in college students
Oh, okay.
and found that the students who ate later relative to the dim light melatonin onset as
Okay.
a marker of the central circadian clock,
Yeah.
they were more likely to be obese and have more adiposity. So higher BMI and more adiposity in those students who ate at a later circadian time. When he looked at the timing of their food intake relative to the clock on the wall, so social time, that relationship fell apart. So suggesting also that food timing relative to your circadian system is what matters, at least for this outcome. Of course, this is an association study.
Okay.
So as you know, association is not causation, but it fits well with another study that we did in our lab.
Okay.
So this was run by Nina Vujovic, who was a postdoctoral fellow in the group. A paper published in 2022, I think it was, in Cell Metabolism, in which we had people eat three identical test meals, either early in the wake episode or late in the wake episode, with equal timing in between the three meals. And then what we've looked at was looked at mechanisms to try to understand why late eating might relate to increased body mass.
Yeah.
And so when you think about body mass, there's two primary factors you think about, right? So one is how much do you eat? So the number of calories you take in. And the other is
Yeah.
how many calories do you burn?
Yeah.
So what's your energy expenditure? So we looked at those two. We also looked at adipose biopsies, so biopsies of fat tissue from
Okay.
these participants, because we wanted to know if the fat maybe behaves differently when you eat earlier or later, and maybe that can help explain why people tend to put on more pounds when they eat later. And so what Nina showed in this highly controlled in-laboratory study is that when people eat later, but what they eat is the same, how much they eat is the
Yeah.
same because we regulate that.
Right.
When they sleep is the same, the physical activity is the same, the light exposure, the room temperature, everything else is the same. So just moving food meals, about 4 hours later, is that going to make any difference? So we wanted to know which of these three outcome measures it might be. And to our surprise, we found that all three were impacted in the direction of increased body mass. So people's hunger went up on average.
Yeah.
This was subjective ratings across the wake episodes. We also looked at hunger hormone leptin and ghrelin, or leptin is a satiety hormone and ghrelin is a hunger hormone.
Yeah.
So the ghrelin to leptin ratio went up, so consistent with their self-report of increased hunger. But also on the other side, we found fewer calories being burned during the wake episodes. We measured this with indirect colorimetry, with ventilated hood, many hours across the wake episode, and also lower core body temperature, which also is consistent. If you have the same environmental temperature and the same clothing and the same physical activity, then if you burn fewer calories, your body temperature goes down. So
Right.
that was consistent as well. And then when we looked at the subcutaneous abdominal adipose biopsies, so fat biopsies, we found that uh, the pathways based on transcriptomics pointed to more adipogenesis and decreased lipolysis, so more growth of fat
Yeah.
and less breakdown of fat. And so that, these provide some mechanisms that may explain why late eating is related to increased body mass and increased adiposity.
Yeah. So I guess this is kind of a question that's been brewing in the back of my mind for a little bit now. Um, if you could only have one, like which one would be more relevant for a healthy body? Either being consistent with when a mealtime is or having it at the right time, like in relation to your circadian clock.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. So we looked a little bit at this in Nina's work. So
Okay.
in that paper, the cell metabolism paper, we looked on the first day when they transitioned, and then we looked on the fourth day after we transitioned them to a later meal. And we had a control protocol where they stayed on an early meal, and it was a randomized crossover protocol. So everybody was their own control, and with a washout of several weeks in between. And what we found was that there wasn't a change across those 4 days. So the effect seemed to be sustained where they were burning fewer calories, indicating more hunger. Well, the adipose we only looked at once, but the other two measures we looked at repeatedly. So that would suggest that at least on a shorter time scale, just a couple of days, that these effects are sustained, so that it's
Yeah.
not just explained by a change in timing. But there is also indication that there might be some adaptation over a longer time of some of these aspects. And so one of these is what I just had mentioned before. So Sauer Shalaba's paper from 2021, in that paper, we did see that, for example, the glucose circadian regulation did shift with the shifting of the meal timing.
Wow.
So what this suggested that there are some aspects of biology that do shift with changing in your eating time, while other factors may not shift and um, may be regulated more by your central clock, of which we know it doesn't shift with meal timing.
Yeah.
And what the hypothesis is there is that some of these factors that do shift, like glucose regulation, might be more driven by peripheral clocks, like in your liver, let's say. We haven't spoken about peripheral clocks in this conversation, but you
Yeah.
probably heard from previous speakers
Yeah. Yeah.
that we don't just have one
Right.
circadian clock, we have a multitude of clocks throughout our body. Every organ and tissue virtually has a clock. So your heart has a clock, and your skin cells have a clock, and your fat tissue has a clock. And so some of these clocks, animal experimental work has shown, can be shifted very effectively by food timing. But the central clock in the suprachiasmatic
Yeah.
nucleus, hypothalamus, it doesn't shift with food timing under typical situations. It's affected primarily by the light-dark cycle.
Yeah.
And so that may explain why some outcomes may adapt and others don't.
So, I guess bringing up the peripheral clocks is interesting. So, is it, I guess, are you saying that maybe like some of the peripheral clocks can be like misaligned with the central clock or with each other, like during this like irregularity of meal times to an extent?
Ex-
And then, okay,
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I know exactly. So
Yeah.
that is what is often referred to as internal circadian
Okay.
misalignment. So
Right.
yeah, misalignment within the same organism, it's just between these different clocks, right?
Yeah. And then kind of as a follow-up question, like in disease, like do these peripheral clocks get affected like differently than like I guess the synchrony between all of them? So,
Yeah, that's a good question. So the type of studies required to study peripheral clocks in humans are very intensive, expensive,
are they
involved.
invasive too, I'm guessing?
Well, to that, not that invasive.
Okay.
Well, depends on how you define having an IV catheter in for
Okay.
blood sampling. When we do biopsies, that's more invasive,
Right.
but we don't do that many. Um, so one lab, Jonathan Johnston in Surrey in the UK, his lab has done repeated adipose, so fat tissue sampling. So
Yeah.
then you need a biopsy taken repeatedly, so that's more involved. Uh, so the type of studies needed to do this is, yeah, it's quite involved. And so most of the studies that have been done, therefore, are in healthy controls.
Yeah.
We've done studies in people who have asthma, who have hypertension, who have obesity, who have prediabetes, who have epilepsy. So we have studied some patient populations in that regard, but it's a higher bar before we bring them in. And so the short answer is we don't really know. There are some suggestions that that might be the case that and for example, there is some work in cancer
Yeah.
where people have looked in different cancer types, and in some cancer types, it might be that the rhythm is gone, and other cancer types, it
Yeah.
might be that the rhythm is shifted. And if one knows that,
Yeah.
that can be really valuable because, for example, Francis Levy has built his whole career on initially animal experimental work and later human trials to look at the timing of chemotherapy, so chronochemotherapy, and asking the question whether you can change the timing of your of your chemotherapy dosing to
Yeah.
maximize the effect in destroying the cancer cells
And
while minimizing the side effects on the healthy cells.
yeah.
And in part, that is built on if you, theoretically, if you would know that your cancer cells are at a different time in their division cycle, say, which is also in part regulated by the circadian system, then you could hit them hardest when they're
Yeah.
most vulnerable.
Yeah. And that's actually something that was happening in Dr. Herzog's lab when I was there. There was a graduate student working on, I guess, like the timing of chemotherapy and then how that informs
Mhm.
like chemotherapy or sorry, like the timing of like cancer and like the kind of clocks and then how that influences like when chemotherapy should be administered, I guess, for like the most optimal results. And I
Right.
think that's a big thing actually Dr. Herzog has been doing. So, yeah.
Nice.
And then I guess another thing I wanted to talk about is recovery sleep.
Mhm.
And could you just explain like how recovery sleep works and what it can and cannot do?
Sure. Well, to the best of my knowledge,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
so recovery sleep. So what you typically see, and this is one of the definitions actually of sleep, because not in all organisms can you necessarily rely on polysomnography, like
Right.
electrodes on scalps, etc. So think about um, a C. elegans, like a worm or so. You may not be able to do a PhD there. So one of the definitions or characteristics of sleep is that if you prevent it from occurring, so sleep restricting the organism, then what you will see is you will see rebound sleep, meaning that you will see more sleep occurring afterwards than otherwise would have occurred. And that's an indication that there is a increase in drive for sleep and presumably a need for sleep as well.
Yeah.
And so recovery sleep, what happens is that if you sleep deprive yourself or you restrict your sleep, then your homeostatic pressure for sleep will build up, will be higher.
The adenosine.
Sorry?
The
It,
adenosine, right?
adenosine is one of the players,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
And there are likely many players. But
Yeah.
adenosine levels have been shown to increase in certain brain areas.
Yeah.
And so it's of course also why caffeine is so effective because
Right.
it
Yeah.
blocks adenosine
Yeah.
receptor. But yeah, so in part due to adenosine rising, your homeostatic sleep pressure rises, and that increased homeostatic sleep pressure will not only make you sleep more, but also deeper. So if you then initiate your recovery sleep, you typically see more slow wave activity, so more power, not just more a longer duration of slow wave sleep, but also deeper slow wave sleep with larger amplitude slow wave oscillations. And so the idea is that this allows your brain and your body to recover more effectively when you need it more.
Yeah.
And so typically what you see is that even though that's the case and people may sleep longer, they can't fully recover from a, let's say you do have a full night that you don't sleep and you have recovery sleep, you can't fully recover in one subsequent sleep episode from that full night of missing sleep.
Right.
So that's kind of your question about what can you and what can you not recover. Well, it will take several nights to kind of recover in the amount of sleep you get, and also your cognitive function, which is easier to measure than a lot of the physiological outcome measures,
Yeah.
will then also recover more gradually after a couple of nights.
Yeah. And as a high schooler myself, like I and a lot of my friends, like we try to catch up on sleep during the weekends. And I
Right?
guess like we only have like 2 days to like really do that. And then we're back at it again. So I guess I don't know like how effective it is, but yeah.
Yeah. The problem is, like you pointed out, so you have
Yeah.
2 nights basically, right?
Yeah.
So typically the Friday nights,
Yeah. Friday night and Saturday.
students typically don't yet start with sleeping early, although
That's
maybe
true.
now.
Yeah. Friday nights tends to be more active. Yeah.
Right. Typically it's the Saturday and the Sunday night, but
And then I guess Sunday night goes into Monday.
and
So it's really just one night, I
right,
guess,
Sunday
in
night
a way.
goes into Monday, so your sleep is truncated. So it depends really, but anyway, the essence is there. The other problem is that um, across the 5 days, the school days, you are building up this increased homeostatic sleep pressure. And so every day you get worse in a way. Now, the other interesting thing, and this is uh, referring back to work by Hans van Dongen, um, who has done so together with Dave Dinges, who done this kind of elegant study in which they looked at the agreement or disagreement between different readouts of the effects of sleep loss. So what did they do? They looked at both objective and subjective measures of sleepiness. So subjective is just
Yeah.
asking people how sleepy are you, and objectively they looked at reaction times. And what they did is they then had people sleep for either 8, 6, 4, or 0 hours across nights, and then they had them do that repeatedly. For the 0 hours, I think they had missed 2 nights in total, if I'm not mistaken. But for the 8, 6, and 4, I think it was a week or more. And what they found is that the subjective rating of sleepiness showed this kind of gradual plateau where people, if they had 4 nights of sleep and then the next night again 4 nights and the next night again 4 nights, they didn't rate themselves to become more sleepy. But if you look objectively, they became worse and worse and worse and worse, which also points out that people are not great judges of their own
Yeah.
impact of their sleep loss. And
That
so
that has come up before in this podcast. Yeah.
yeah, so you may think you're doing okay,
Yeah.
while in reality you're not. And so that's another issue with the 5 days of missing out on sleep.
Yeah.
If you do this, so it's much better if you can, of course, to really prioritize your sleep. And it's not just because you feel better, but you also will be more alert, you'll retain better. You may want to talk to people about the effects of sleep on
Yeah.
memory and learning and
Yeah,
consolidation,
that's true.
which is, of course, a very key aspect
Yeah.
of sleep and
Especially for like high
performance.
schoolers and college students who are like
Exactly.
learning, right? So,
Yeah.
do you know Dr. Jamie Zeitger by any chance?
Jamie Zeitzer. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I did an interview with them, I think, like about a week or two ago, and we were literally
Nice.
talking just how you were, how like people are very bad judges of their own sleep, and I was asking him like, how do people like get or like think they can function or function with little sleep? And reality, like, there's some things that they think they're doing well, but they're really not.
Right.
So, and I guess my final question for you here before we wrap up is, looking ahead, what areas of circadian medicine are you most excited about in the future?
Yeah. Good question. I think one of the challenges in the field, and many people are trying to solve this challenge,
Yeah.
is determining what an individual circadian phase is. So where are you now
Yeah, that
in your
topic has come up a
circadian
lot.
cycle at this
Yeah.
time? And
Yeah.
that's a really challenging question.
Yeah.
The approach that people classically have taken is measuring dim light melatonin onset, which is
Right.
still the gold standard. So what you do is you measure when concentrations of the hormone melatonin start to rise if you keep people in dim light conditions.
Yeah.
And this happens typically about 2 hours or so before people's habitual bedtime.
Yeah.
But it can vary, depending on the population by many hours when this occurs. The issue with this method, even though it's still the gold standard, is that it's very involved. It requires a long time,
Yeah.
like 7, 8 hours under controlled dim light conditions. There's expertise needed from the investigative team or the clinical team, and the participants, their compliance is paramount.
Yeah.
So the alternative approaches, there are kind of two main approaches that people have tried. One is wearables. So can you use
Yeah.
wearables to
Yeah.
try to predict when somebody's circadian phase is? And typically people try to predict the central circadian clock because remember we just spoke about all these other
Right.
peripheral clocks. And so that's
Yeah.
something to keep in the back of your mind. But the main approach that people have taken is to see whether you can have single time point biomarkers.
Like time signature? Like, is that
Exactly,
okay? Yeah.
exactly. So this goes back to Linnaeus's clock, so his flower clock. So the concept there is that you uh, Linnaeus, when he was I don't think he actually built his flower clock garden, but his concept was that if you have a garden
Yeah.
with all type of different flowers that open and close at different times of the day, that then if you would take a snapshot, or I guess back then a painting of the garden at one particular time of day, you should be able to figure out what time of day it is
Yeah.
without knowing where the sun is, just by the mere fact that one flower is a little bit open, the other is fully open, the other is fully closed, etc. The combination of flowers only occurs at a very particular time of day. And
Yeah.
that very same concept applies to, let's say, blood-borne biomarkers or hair follicles or skin
Yeah.
biopsies, and using omics techniques, so transcriptomics, proteomics,
Yeah.
uh, metabolomics.
Yeah. And
That
then on that note, like our meeting's about to end, but thank you for joining me today. And I know it's like an abrupt ending, but it's like about to end, so I just wanted to wrap it up. But thank you so
Yeah,
much for
my
your time.
pleasure.
And